Today we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. We remember that the Tet Offensive was the single biggest coordinated attack between the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army regulars on virtually every major South Vietnamese city and military installation. All right? And we talked about the Tet Offensive being an absolute military defeat for the communist forces, right? All of the ground they overtook, including the city of Saigon, including the American embassy in Saigon, would be quickly retaken by American and South Vietnamese forces. And when all was said and done in the Tet Offensive, almost more than 30,000 communist forces were estimated to have been killed in that offensive, which was almost 40% of that invasion force. While the Americans and the South Vietnamese lost just a tenth of that. After the Tet Offensive, General William Westmoreland, the American leader in the field, asked President Johnson for another 200,000 troops. Seeing, probably rightfully so, seeing that the Tet Offensive was an American and South Vietnamese victory, actually, and if only we could get some more American troops in the field, we can continue to drive the communists out of South Vietnam. He asked Johnson for 200,000 more troops. Now we want to remember, how many troops are in South Vietnam? How many Americans are in South Vietnam in 1968? Yes, Eddie? We got 500,000 guys. So to add another 200,000, that's a 40% increase in our force in South Vietnam. So that would be a dramatic escalation. Westmoreland asked Johnson for that escalation, and Johnson rejects that escalation. And here's where you guys can kind of decide why you think Johnson is doing what he's doing. Does he believe that another 200,000 men aren't going to make a difference? Does he believe that he's already told the American people that we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and the Tet Offensive proves that this war is not any closer to being won? Does he believe that 200,000 more men won't make a difference? Does he believe that American popular sentiment after the Tet Offensive is now starting to turn so much against our continued war in Vietnam that it could jeopardize the Democratic chances in the 1968 election? Or maybe all of the above. Remember, November 1968, we have another presidential election. Johnson ultimately denies that increase, and he starts to push on the government of South Vietnam for not only better political performance, to create a more stable governing system in South Vietnam, which is hard to do. Remember, what's the greatest challenge for the government in South Vietnam in the midst of this war? What's that? Okay, they've got a lot of overturning of their government. That is one problem. But then as the United States and South Vietnamese Army are in the field in South Vietnam, and we are bombing in South Vietnam as well. Remember, 2/3 of the bombs we drop in the Vietnam War are being dropped in South Vietnam. So as we bomb in South Vietnam, we're disrupting the countryside. And there's a flood of refugees going from the countryside into the big cities. This is another challenge that the government has to manage. Johnson is also pushing the ARVN troops, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, to take more of a lead in this fight. Johnson will decline his party's nomination for president. And this is rare, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking unprecedented. Anybody know of a case in American history where an American president, not including Washington set the precedent where our president will only serve 2 terms. But can anybody think of a president in his first term who chose to not run for re-election? I can't. Like, we've had one-term presidents that lost their election, but I can't think of a guy that just declined his party's nomination. Johnson does that. Guys, the Vietnam War and maybe more importantly the Tet Offensive in January, February of 1968, they break Johnson's presidency. He declines to run again. Now he's going to put a good face on this. He tells the American people that he sees it as more important to focus on the duties of the presidency than engage in partisan politics of an election. Does he really believe that? I don't know. He doesn't run again, though. Yes?
Were people not
Well, the general consensus was starting to turn against the war. Remember we looked at this chart the other day? Once we get to the Tet Offensive in early 1968, we now see the majority of Americans seeing the war in Vietnam as a mistake, that we should have never sent troops. And while the first advisors were sent under Eisenhower and more advisors were sent under Kennedy, who has sent the vast majority of the men into South Vietnam? That was Johnson. So yeah, he might not have won that election. He probably wouldn't have won that election. All right? So in this final year of Johnson's presidency, negotiations will begin with North Vietnam. But these negotiations are very difficult, because neither side can really see eye to eye to openly negotiate at this point in the war. For example, North Vietnam does not want to open up negotiations until the bombing stops. North Vietnam is using that as like a bargaining chip of their own. Hey, we will talk to you, but we will not talk to you while you're bombing North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder, that began back in February of 1965, that's still going on all the way into 1968. So until you stop the bombing of North Vietnam, we won't negotiate. And then on the flip side, the United States won't negotiate openly until, or pardon me, they won't stop the bombing until the negotiations begin. Because remember, the bombing is our bargaining chip. So this is a catch-22. We also have a problem in the government of South Vietnam. The government of South Vietnam, from the beginnings of the first discussions to end this conflict, the government of South Vietnam is very apprehensive to bring an end to this war. Because an end to the war in Vietnam means America is going to do what? We're going to go home, right? We're going to leave. And the government of South Vietnam, spoiler alert, rightfully so, the government of South Vietnam feels that if the United States leaves, then the North and the communist forces in the South will be victorious. Paris will be the meeting place for these negotiations. And they begin in May of 1968. While North Vietnam says we don't want to openly negotiate until the bombing stops, the United States tries to force the issue. And we actually escalate our bombing campaigns in North Vietnam. But by the time we get to the end of 1968, in November of 68, President Johnson will order an end to Operation Rolling Thunder in hopes of that pushing the negotiations further. Now, mind you, we don't end Operation Rolling Thunder until November of 1968. What has happened by November of 1968? We have the presidential election pass. Johnson is very nervous about ending Operation Rolling Thunder before there's any kind of victory in this conflict, at least before the election. He doesn't want to hurt the Democrats' chances in the 1968 election. Now let's talk for a moment more about the 1968 election. The victor is obviously going to be Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, we remember from being the vice president of Dwight Eisenhower. Nixon is the guy that ran against Kennedy back in 1960, but he lost. Remember, that was kind of the interesting story of Kennedy accusing Nixon and the Eisenhower administration of being weak on communism and allowing the creation of a missile gap, that the Soviets had more missile capabilities than we did. But this was completely false. Nixon knew it was false. Eisenhower knew it was false, but they were not at liberty to share that information because it was classified. And Nixon got beat up over it in the election. Yeah?
He was not a crook, right?
Not yet. Not yet. So anyway, in the 1968 election, Richard Nixon is going to be victorious. The Democratic side of the election, he runs against a guy named Hubert Humphrey. You guys don't really need to worry about him for our purposes. But the Democrats had a rough time. First, the incumbent president, President Johnson, declined to take his party's nomination. Then in the primary season, which we're now just starting up right now, in the primary season, the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination was Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother. And Robert Kennedy, in the summer of 1968, leading up to this election, would be assassinated. So it leaves Hubert Humphrey, who wasn't the most popular figure in the Democratic Party, as being their candidate, and he ultimately won't win the election. Nixon is going to pledge to the American people that if he is elected, we will get out of Vietnam. He will end the Vietnam War. It's a campaign promise. People aren't happy about the Vietnam War. I promise to get us out of Vietnam if you elect me. And in November, Nixon's elected. Obviously, in January of the following year, January of '69, Nixon takes office. Yes?
Did Humphrey say that he was going to get out of Vietnam too?
Humphrey was advocating, absolutely. Humphrey was advocating for the ending of bombing in Vietnam, kind of splitting from Johnson's administration, trying to distance himself from Johnson's administration.
Just the bombing or getting food too?
At this point, he was just talking about ending the bombing campaign to enter into negotiations. The Democratic Party, though, under Johnson, got us into the war and escalated the war. This election was Nixon's to lose. So Nixon is elected, and in power, we want to know about, this guy. Here's Richard Nixon, and this is Henry Kissinger, one of the more important political figures of the latter half of the 20th century. Henry Kissinger is a German-born American, and in the late 1940s, early 1950s, he wrote some scholarly work on like nuclear arms and how to politically handle nuclear arms, and he got pretty prominent in the intellectual world because of some of his writings. Richard Nixon would tap Henry Kissinger to be his national security advisor. Later, Richard Nixon is going to make Henry Kissinger his Secretary of State. Richard Nixon is going to make Henry Kissinger his Secretary of State. And so he will eventually be Secretary of State under Nixon, and then Secretary of State under Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford. So, Richard Nixon wants to end this war, but he doesn't want to just bring American troops out and lose South Vietnam. Nixon wants what he calls peace with honor. He wants to achieve an end to the war and bring peace to Vietnam. But he can't do that while allowing South Vietnam to fall. So he's got to be able to leave, but leave South Vietnam in a position where it can still exist and defend itself. And this is based largely on Kissinger's notions of what we call realpolitik. Realpolitik is a German word, appropriate because Kissinger is German. And this idea is really born in the late 1800s out of Germany, a guy named Otto von Bismarck, but we don't need to get into him today. Realpolitik says, and we'll talk more about this when we get back into the Cold War story, but basically realpolitik is stressing pragmatism rather than idealism. When I say pragmatism, I mean let's kind of be realistic about what is going to work best in the world for us. What is going to result in America being in the best position we could possibly be in. Rather than idealism. And when I say idealism, I mean, remember, we've been operating since NSC 68 in 1950 that said all communism of the world is bad, right? And it's all being directed by Moscow. Well, in the late 60s, early 70s, Richard Nixon saw the results of that ideology getting us involved in places like Vietnam. And that we can't continue to fight every single little communist uprising around the world. It spreads America too thin. It's costing us a lot in the world scene. And then look what is happening to America on a global scene as we've been bombing North Vietnam and South Vietnam since 1965. What's happening to people's feelings about the United States from 65 to 69? Not too good. Did I mention the United Nations already condemned American bombing in North Vietnam? Yeah. So, realpolitik says, you know what? We get it. Communism's not great. We don't like that system. But maybe the sliver of land in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, maybe that's not the most important chunk of the world for America to be expending such a massive amount of effort that doesn't seem to be benefiting the United States on a global scene. Who were always our biggest concerns in the Cold War story? China and the Soviet Union. Vietnam is just an offshoot. obviously connected to those countries, but just an offshoot problem. And is our war against the North Vietnamese, is that hurting our relationship with China and the Soviet Union? Well, Kissinger would say, yeah. Like if we can end this war in Vietnam, we might be able to ease some tensions that we have maybe with China. We'll talk about that more at a later date. All right? And then we can start playing the Chinese against the Soviets. And that's going to work out well for us. So the idea is, instead of seeing communism is bad, communism is bad, communism is bad, communism is bad, and we must deal with it at all costs, maybe there's some costs that aren't worth spending. And Kissinger is going to want Nixon, and going to encourage Nixon, we've got to end this fight so we can get on better footing on the more important issues that the United States would deal with, like the Chinese or the Soviets. All right? But we still don't want to just walk away from South Vietnam. Can't have South Vietnam fall. Because if South Vietnam falls and becomes communist, what does every group around the world that wants to maybe push to communism, what do they now learn about the United States? Yeah, that maybe we aren't in it for the long haul, that if you just fight us for a handful of years, we eventually get tired or frustrated and we go home, despite the fact of having the most advanced military in the world. So listening to Kissinger, Richard Nixon will issue what's called the Nixon Doctrine. There's another doctrine to add to our list. We have the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, focus on the Middle East in the Cold War, and now the Nixon Doctrine. But the Nixon Doctrine is a complete 180-degree turn from where the Truman Doctrine once left the United States. The Nixon Doctrine says that nations themselves are responsible for their own defense. Nations themselves are responsible for their own defense. Let me read a quote from President Nixon. If domination by the aggressor can destroy the freedom of a nation, too much dependency on a protector can eventually erode its dignity. So if the only thing that is keeping South Vietnam as a sovereign nation is the United States there holding it together, then what kind of sovereign nation is South Vietnam? And the United States can't possibly hold together every country in the world that might have issues. So the Nixon Doctrine says countries themselves must take the primary responsibility for their own defense. Our initial goal, though, when Nixon comes to office, is absolutely to win this war militarily. And in order to do that, we're going to escalate our bombing campaigns in North Vietnam. Remember, President Johnson had ended Operation Rolling Thunder in November of '68. Nixon comes in, and we resume bombing campaigns of the North. And in fact, we will start running covert bombing operations across the border into Laos in the north and into Cambodia. Every one of these red dots represents an American bombing incident during the Vietnam War. And so obviously the majority of our bombing is happening within the border of Vietnam, but all of this is in Cambodia. All of this is in Laos. So we start to bomb over the border of Cambodia and Laos. Yes?
Does that combine strategic and tactical bombing? Like, are they making a difference between somebody calling in fire support and like bombing a factory?
Yeah, this is mostly going to be like strategic bombing, trying to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail network and supplies making it into South Vietnam. Initially, this was kept secret, but a version of Edward Snowden back in 1971 is going to get his hands on some classified documents of the American military. They're called the Pentagon Papers, and they will be published in the New York Times in 1971. Top secret Department of Defense documents that report on America's involvement in Vietnam and show that the United States is actually going over the border into Laos and Cambodia. And if the American people were starting to question our role in Vietnam and the stories that our government was telling us, which they were, like how can you tell us the war is almost won in December of 1967, And then the next month, the Tet Offensive happens. We don't trust you anymore. The Pentagon Papers push that distrust even further. Declassified in 2000, even more documents were released and declassified that showed that the United States had actually been bombing into Cambodia and Laos as early as 1965 under President Johnson. Yeah. No, they were not accidentally leaked. Yeah.
When was the My Lai massacre?
The My Lai massacre was in 1970. I think 1971. I got to look that up. I don't have it on the top of my head. So anyway, more Americans are going to start questioning American involvement, continued American involvement in the war. Yeah.
So I kind of don't understand why we're so concerned about things that Cambodia and Laos were still getting bombed.
Okay, why is it a bad thing that we are bombing Cambodia and Laos here? Like if we're already bombing Vietnam, and guys remember, I've already mentioned this, but we will drop more bombs on Vietnam, North and South, than in the entirety of the Second World War, Pacific theater and European theater. Okay, and this is a relatively small territory, right? So what does it matter if we start dropping bombs in Cambodia and Laos? What does that really matter? Well, if we recall the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, right? The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was directed at what country? North Vietnam. There's nothing in the congressional approval for President Johnson to escalate in defense of South Vietnam. There was nothing in there that mentioned that he could go targeting other countries as well. And so now it looks like this is starting to turn into like a mini world war in Southeast Asia. So that's really the problem there. Negotiations are still at a stalemate. When President Nixon adopts the policy of Vietnamization. Vietnamization is the Nixon Doctrine in action. If the Nixon Doctrine says a nation has to be responsible for its own military operations, its own defense, Vietnamization is that policy that puts the Nixon Doctrine in action. And essentially what we have are South Vietnamese soldiers, ARVN soldiers, who will begin to take a more active and eventually complete role in the defense of their own nation. So the process of Vietnamization is essentially American soldiers pulling back to their bases and eventually pulling out of the country, while South Vietnamese soldiers, the ARVN troops, will take a bigger role in the war. We are still going to keep bombing because South Vietnam doesn't have an air force like ours. We will still keep our bombing campaigns to keep pressure on the North. We will support ARVN troops in the field, but we begin to pull American troops out. This will allow us to start to draw down our troop numbers in Vietnam, and we begin to do that by June of 1969. So President Nixon promises to get us out of the Vietnam War, to end the Vietnam War, and within the first 5 months of his presidency, he starts bringing troops home. Some in the American military, and certainly some in South Vietnam, see this as the beginning of an American surrender in Vietnam. And within 2 years of our first troop withdrawals, we will cut our numbers in Vietnam in half. But the bombing campaigns are continuing. We are still bombing North Vietnam. Protest movements in the United States continue to grow, especially in light of the released Pentagon Papers. And the war will continue for 2 more years. Questions, comments, concerns?